You're listening to the story of She Was the Chief's Daughter and She Risked Her Life to Save a Captive Cowboy. It's a tale of silence, danger, and a forbidden act of mercy set in the heart of the wild frontier, where one young woman defied everything to save a stranger. The year was 1871, and the Texas panhandle stretched endlessly beneath a punishing sun. The wind there wasn't just a breeze, it spoke in low moans, carrying dust and secrets across miles of open prairie. For 19-year-old Nathaniel Prescott, that wind was often his only companion. He rode on the edge of a cattle drive, scouting the trail ahead, a job meant for someone quiet and observant. Nate was both. Life had stripped him of noise. Orphaned as a boy and hardened by the relentless demands of frontier life, Nate didn't have family, nor close friends. His parents had been claimed by fever. His older brother vanished years ago chasing dreams of gold somewhere past the Rockies. All Nate had was a horse named Dusty, a saddle slick with wear, and a heart made calloused by too many lonely nights under the stars. Still, he was dependable. The kind of cowboy who didn't complain when meals were cold, or when the work was long. 6 months into this cattle drive, the others still hadn't really gotten to know him. He kept his thoughts locked up and his words to a minimum, content to observe the world rather than wrestle with it. But that quiet was about to be shattered. That afternoon, the air changed. It thickened, pulsing with a strange energy. Nate looked up. The sky had taken on a bruised yellow color. The cattle lowed nervously, sensing what was coming before any man did. Seasoned drovers muttered curses under their breath. Storms like this didn't ask permission. They just arrived. Nate was tracking a small group of strays that had wandered into a series of shallow gullies when the heavens opened up. The storm descended like a beast. Rain fell in sheets so dense it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Thunder cracked overhead like the sky was tearing itself apart. His horse bucked wildly, nearly throwing him. Lightning lit up the earth in white bursts, turning the familiar landscape into a battlefield. And just like that, he was lost. The herd was gone. The other cowboys gone. No hoofbeats, no shouts, just him and the storm. He tried retracing his path, but every direction looked the same. Mud sucked at his boots, and Dusty trembled beneath him. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a twisted world. The gullies had turned into miniature rivers, and Nate's trail was wiped clean by wind and water. The horizon stretched out in all directions, offering no clue as to where he'd come from or where he should go. Still, he tried. That day and the next, he searched. He shouted until his voice cracked, followed every hunch, scanned the skies for smoke or dust clouds. Nothing, only the endless sweep of prairie, made heavier by silence. By the third day, Nate was running out of hope. His canteen was dry, his small sack of jerky was gone. The sun bore down on him relentlessly, and Dusty, loyal as he was, stumbled with every step. Nate's lips cracked from dehydration, his vision blurred. He began to feel a strange lightness in his body, as though he were floating instead of riding. It was at that moment, just as he crested a small rise, that everything changed again. They came silently, as though they were part of the earth itself. A dozen Kiowa warriors, mounted and painted for war, rose from the landscape like ghosts. Nate's heart pounded. He reached for his rifle, but realized his mistake instantly. There was no time. One of the warriors was already beside him. Another yanked him from the saddle. His hat flew off. Dusty reared, but was quickly caught and pulled away. Strong hands forced him down, binding his wrists with rawhide. The leather bit into his skin. Someone grabbed his face, inspecting him with unreadable eyes. Another pulled a knife, letting it glint in the sun for a moment before tucking it away. Nate braced for death. He'd heard stories. Cowboys didn't survive being taken, especially not alone, but death didn't come. Instead, he was hoisted to his feet, the bindings around his wrists and ankles restricting every movement. One of the warriors tied a lead to the rawhide around Nate's wrists and mounted up, dragging him forward. Another took Dusty. The ride was long and punishing. The sun baked him, The rawhide cut deeper with each jolt. He couldn't understand their words, only the tone. Sharp, clipped, commanding. His mouth was dry, his skin burned, and every movement sent pain shooting through his shoulders. He thought of his mother's gentle voice, of his brother's laugh around a campfire. Those memories, once warm, now twisted in his gut like a blade. To them, he wasn't a man. He was something else, a trophy. Perhaps a warning, a threat neutralized. He didn't matter. By the time they reached the Kiowa encampment, Nate was nearly unconscious. He was pulled from the horse and dropped near a smoldering fire at the center of camp. His wrists and ankles were rebound. He lay there, chest heaving, eyes barely open. Children stared at him with wide, curious eyes. Women worked in silence, some pausing briefly to glance at him, their expressions unreadable. One or two looked away quickly. Others didn't bother hiding their distrust. And then a figure stepped forward from the largest lodge, a tall man with hair streaked in gray, his expression carved from stone. This was the chief, that much Nate could tell. The other warriors approached him, speaking in sharp bursts, gesturing toward Nate. The chief said nothing at first, he just looked. And that's when Nate saw her, standing just behind the chief, partially hidden in shadow, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 17, with dark braided hair and a soft deerskin dress. Her eyes met his, calm, piercing, and filled with something he couldn't name. Not hate, not pity, curiosity, sympathy. In that moment, when everything else had been stripped away, Nate saw her clearly. And for the first time since the storm, he began to believe he might survive. Nate woke before dawn, his body stiff and sore. The ropes around his wrists and ankles had dug in deeper overnight, and his skin burned from sun exposure. Every breath tasted like smoke and fear. He'd been tossed near the edge of the Kiowa camp, close enough to smell roasting meat, yet far enough to know he wasn't welcome. The camp had come alive with the rhythm of daily survival. Warriors sharpened knives, women prepared meals, and children played in bursts of laughter that quickly quieted whenever they wandered too close to the bound white man. Nate didn't try to speak. His throat was too dry, and even if it weren't, he didn't know what words could help him hear. Any plea would be lost in translation or worse, interpreted as weakness. So he sat, eyes low, heart thudding, that same young warrior from before Hanya returned. He was wiry, restless, and always seemed to be watching Nate with a twisted smile. That morning, he approached with something in his hand, a stick, or a spear shaft. He jabbed Nate's ribs playfully, then made a slicing motion across his throat while grinning. Nate flinched but didn't cry out. He wouldn't give the boy the satisfaction. It was a game for some of them. The new captive, a living embodiment of everything that threatened their world: railroads, settlers, fences. Nate knew enough about history to understand that. But not all games ended in laughter. That evening, just before dusk, a few of the older warriors sat in a circle, speaking in tones too serious to ignore. Hanya lingered behind them, throwing Nate the occasional glance. At the edge of the circle stood the chief Dahausen. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it was unreadable, like stone smoothed by years of rain. He gave no indication whether Nate would live or die. And then she appeared again. The chief's daughter. Mesa. She didn't speak. She simply walked past Nate with a basket of herbs or food, he couldn't tell which. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He tried to look grateful, to communicate something across the gulf of culture and language. She gave no expression in return, but he could feel it, the weight of her glance. She saw him, not just as a prisoner, but as a person. That night, tied up beneath a canopy of stars, Nate could barely move. His shoulders throbbed, his mouth felt like cotton. His stomach twisted with hunger. Then, in the blackness beyond the dying campfires, he sensed movement. He tensed, expecting Hanya, but the figure that emerged was smaller, quieter. It was Mesa. She knelt beside him without a word. In her hands, a small gourd. She tilted it gently to his lips. The water, cool and fresh, made him gasp. Then came a small strip of dried meat. She placed it in his hand, their fingers brushing. It was the first act of kindness he'd received in days. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but she put a finger to her lips. A warning. Then, as silently as she had come, she vanished back into the darkness. Nate lay there, stunned. Not just by the water or the food, but by the risk she had taken. Helping him wasn't just taboo. It could cost her everything, her reputation, maybe even her life, and yet she had done it. Why? He stared at the stars, the taste of water still lingering. Mace's gesture had planted something dangerous inside him. Hope. The next few days blurred together. Nate remained bound, barely fed, never spoken to directly. Mesa visited in secret, never staying long. Sometimes she brought a piece of cooked root or bread, sometimes just a glance. During the day, he watched the rhythm of the camp, the way the children played, how the women worked without complaint. The warriors came and went, hunting or scouting. He learned to recognize their patterns. He realized something else too. Most of them weren't evil, just angry, tired, guarding what little they had left. Mesa, on the other hand, was different. Even among her people, she moved like someone set apart. She was respected, yes, but there was a quiet distance in how others treated her. Perhaps it was because she was the chief's daughter. Or maybe because she saw the world in a way others didn't. Single quotes. One afternoon, Nate watched her tend to a small girl who had scraped her knee. Mace's expression softened in a way Nate hadn't seen before. She smiled gently, brushed the child's hair, and offered her a piece of dried fruit. Then, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes found Nate's again. He didn't look away. They were bound by silence, yet something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, not friendship, not yet, but the beginning of something deeper than fear. But fear still had a place. That evening, Hanya Hawker returned. This time, he brought a rope. He mimicked the motion of tying a noose, stepping closer, his smile wide and menacing. Nate tensed. This wasn't a joke anymore. Just as Hanya Hawker reached for him, a single sharp word cut through the camp. To Hazen. The chief's voice carried the weight of finality. Hanya Hawker froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, scowling, the young warrior stepped back and vanished into the shadows. Nate exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. He didn't know if it was mercy or strategy that kept him alive, but he was still breathing, and Mesa still hadn't given up on him. The balance was fragile, but it was holding for now. Time passed strangely in the Kiowa camp. There were no clocks or calendars, only the rhythm of the sun, the pace of the chores, the beat of the drums at dusk. Nate had begun to measure his days not by meals or movement, but by the moments when she appeared. Mesa. Every night she came, quiet as a shadow, bringing just enough to keep him alive. A sip of water, a scrap of meat, her eyes always scanning the camp, her movements precise. She never spoke. Her silence was as much a part of the offering as the food itself. To Nate, she became a constant in a world where nothing else was certain. He didn't know why she helped him. Pity, rebellion, curiosity. All he knew was that her presence calmed the storm within him. In the midst of fear and pain, she was the only thing that felt human. And every time she left, he was terrified it would be the last. During the day, Nate remained bound in the camp center, a public display of power, a symbol of captured threat. The children no longer stared as much. The novelty had worn off. Still, some whispered and pointed when they thought no one was watching. The adults were harder to read. Some looked past him like he wasn't there. Others, like Hanya Hawker, made sure he remembered exactly where he was. The young warrior would speak in clipped bursts, his tone sharp, his gestures threatening. Once, he squatted beside Nate, twirling a knife between his fingers, eyes burning with a rage that seemed personal. Nate never responded. He kept his gaze low, his expression neutral. Anything more might provoke the very thing he feared. Mesa continued her silent rebellion. By now, Nate understood the enormous risk she was taking. Among the Kiowa, loyalty was more than expected. It was sacred. Helping a captive, especially a white man, could be seen as treason. Yet she never wavered. Some nights, she only passed by, her gaze meeting his for just a second. And yet that second filled him with more strength than any food. One morning, something shifted. Mesa didn't come the night before. Nate had waited, heart pounding at every rustle of wind, but she never appeared. When the sun rose, his throat was dry, and dread coiled in his gut. Had she been caught? As the camp stirred to life, he noticed something else. Mesa wasn't among the women tending the fire or gathering water. Hanya Haka walked with a swagger, more smug than usual. Nate's fear deepened, but that evening, just before sunset, Mesa returned. She moved quickly, without hesitation, pressing a small piece of cooked root into his hand. Her face looked tired, her eyes haunted. She didn't linger, but her presence alone was enough to tell him she was still fighting, still choosing to help. Still choosing him. Over the next few days, Nate began to observe the camp differently, not through the lens of fear, but with the curiosity Mesa had awoken in him. He noticed how the women worked in quiet efficiency, how the warriors trained, not for chaos, but for order, how the children laughed, just like any others might. This wasn't a savage land, it was a community, one with rules, pain, and pride, and it changed something in him. He'd grown up believing stories about the enemy, but the enemy now had names, faces, routines. A man who carved arrowheads while humming. A woman who scolded her son gently, wiping his nose with her shawl. Children who played tag in the dust. And Mesa, who risked everything for a stranger. That night, when she returned again, Nate met her eyes and held her gaze longer than usual. He tried to say thank you with just a look. With every ounce of emotion his battered body could muster, her expression didn't change. But her fingers lingered just a little longer on his hand. Later, that week, tension in the camp rose again. Hanya Haka had returned from a hunting party, his pride high. He barked commands louder, smiled more smugly, and on one particularly still afternoon, Nate saw him practicing knots with a rope, knots he didn't need for hunting. That night, Mesa came late. Her hands trembled as she offered him water. She didn't bring food, just the water and a single, whispered word, the first she had ever spoken to him. Soon, she glanced over her shoulder, eyes full of urgency, then disappeared into the night. Nate didn't sleep. What did soon mean? Escape? Death? He didn't know, but he trusted her. The following day, Nate noticed something odd. Mesa wasn't working. She wasn't even in sight. Tahausen, the chief, remained stoic as always, but he spoke more to his warriors. Arguments flared low and tense. Hanya Haka gestured toward Nate often, and Tahausen hesitated. Something was coming. That night, Mesa appeared again, this time with a small bundle tucked under her arm. She knelt beside him without a word and produced flint, a handful of dried food, and a leather pouch with water. She began loosening his bindings. Nate's heart slammed in his chest. Was this it? His chance? Mesa's hands moved quickly, expertly. Then she looked him in the eyes and whispered, "Go." She pointed toward the far side of the ravine where the shadows were thickest, away from the sentries. He hesitated, not out of fear for himself, but for her. If she were caught. She touched his arm and whispered again, this time with more force, "Go." And he did. Nathaniel moved into the shadows like a wounded animal, slow, cautious, breath held tight in his lungs. Every dry twig and crunch of soil beneath his boots felt impossibly loud. His hands still ached from the bindings Mesa had just removed, and the bundle she'd given him pressed tight against his chest. Flint, dried meat, a bit of water. It wasn't much, but it was life. Behind him, the Kiowa camp remained still, unaware for now. Somewhere in one of those lodges, Mesa would be slipping back into the darkness, pretending nothing had happened, but Nate knew the truth. She'd just risked everything. He paused for a second near the edge of the cottonwoods, glancing back. The campfire embers glowed faintly, and for a brief, painful moment, he imagined her standing there, watching him disappear. His throat tightened, then he turned and ran, or tried to. His body was weak, starved, sunburnt, and stiff from days of confinement. Each step was like dragging a sack of stones. But the adrenaline pushed him forward. Mesa had made her choice now. It was his turn to make it count. By sunrise, Nate had put several miles between himself and the camp. He found a shallow depression in the earth, barely big enough to crawl into, and hid beneath tall brush, trying to rest during the daylight hours. He couldn't risk traveling in the sun. The plains were too open, too exposed, and he had no idea how far the nearest trail, outpost, or ranch was. His only compass was the morning sun and his instinct to move west toward where he thought the cattle trail had once been. He chewed the dried meat Mesa had given him, rationing it with care. The water he drank slowly, every drop a gift. He tried not to think of her but failed. Her face hovered at the edge of every thought. What would happen to her if they found out? Would they punish her, shame her? Would Hanya Haka, so full of hate, turn his vengeance on her now that the white boy was gone? Guilt tore through him. But still, he moved. By the third night, Nate was beginning to fade. The meat was gone, the water long since emptied. He tried catching a rabbit, but had no tools, just a rock and a stick. It ended in failure and frustration. He gnawed on bitter roots, unsure if they were poisonous. He drank from muddy puddles, gagging, praying not to fall ill. He forced himself onward because the only thing worse than dying out here was dying and letting Mesa's sacrifice mean nothing. At one point, he thought he heard hooves in the distance. He threw himself into a thorn bush, body cramping with fear. A small group of riders passed Kiowa, from the war paint and horses. They didn't see him. He stayed hidden long after they were gone. That night, he dreamed of fire, of Hanya Haka's rope tightening, of Mesa whispering go as flames rose behind her. He awoke in a cold sweat, unsure where dream ended and memory began. On the fifth day, he saw something dust, rising faintly on the horizon, a sign of people. Maybe soldiers, maybe a ranch, maybe danger. He didn't know. Too weak to run, he staggered forward, stumbling toward the moving cloud like a man crawling through a mirage. It wasn't a mirage. A group of cowboys rode into view, rifles slung across their backs. Nate fell to his knees. One of them jumped from his horse, running over. Nate tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. His throat was raw, his lips cracked. The man knelt beside him, shouting for water. The others gathered around. They didn't recognize Nate at first. He looked like a ghost. But when they lifted him up and asked his name, someone muttered, "Prescott, that the boy we lost in the storm." They wrapped him in blankets, gave him water. A woman at a nearby settlement rough but kind cleaned his wounds and fed him broth until he could keep it down. It took nearly a week before he could walk more than a few feet. Through it all, he didn't say a word about Mesa. Not because he forgot, because he would never forget. They'd never understand. If he told them a Kiowa girl, daughter of a chief, had saved his life, they'd twist it into something else. Maybe accuse her of trickery, or worse, claim she had been soft weak. Maybe they'd want revenge. So Nate kept the story to himself. He simply said he got caught in the storm, separated, survived on his own. No mention of warriors, no mention of rope, no mention of the girl with the steady eyes and quiet courage. But her memory followed him. At night, when he lay under a new sky, safe and fed, her face would appear. When wind rustled through grass just the right way, it sounded like her whisper. Go. He often thought about what might have happened if he hadn't. What if he'd stayed and they'd found her helping him? What if Tahausen hadn't spoken up? When Hanya Haka pulled that rope, she had saved him in more ways than one. And now, all he could do was live in a way that honored her risk. Nathaniel Prescott didn't speak of the Kiowa camp for many years. Not to the other cowhands who joked about scalp hunters and raiding parties. Not to the saloon folk who passed around whiskey and wild stories. and certainly not to the men who still wore blue coats and spoke of taming the West, because the truth wasn't something they'd believe or something they deserved. Mace's story belonged to him now. A secret etched not on paper, but into the marrow of his bones. She had risked everything: status, safety, even her life for a man she didn't know, who represented a world closing in on hers. And she had asked for nothing in return. No thanks, no promise. Just a wordless trust that he would survive, and Nate did. But he was no longer the same. In the months that followed his rescue, Nate stayed near the settlement where he'd been nursed back to health. He worked with horses, chopped wood, said little. The others thought him quiet, maybe touched in the head from the ordeal. He didn't correct them. Sometimes he'd walk out to the edge of town at dusk and stare north, toward the ravines and rivers he could never forget, where smoke once curled above hide lodges and warriors rode like wind. He never saw Mesa again. He didn't expect to. That world and his had crossed only for a moment, a brief breath, before history slammed the door shut again. But he kept her memory alive in small ways. He left bits of food on his windowsill for the birds, just enough for them to survive the cold. He gave water to strangers before they asked. He helped the sick and the weak without question. None of it could repay what she'd done. But it was the only way he knew how to honor her. Years passed. The frontier changed. Railroads carved through the land like iron veins. Towns sprang up where buffalo once roamed. The Kiowa were pushed into smaller and smaller pieces of earth. The old life, Mace's life, faded from view, replaced by barbed wire and boundary lines. Nate never joined the talk of conquest. When men spoke of savages and victories, he'd get up and leave. Some called him soft. Others just stopped inviting him to sit near the fire. He didn't mind. They hadn't seen her eyes. They hadn't felt the touch of her hand as she pressed water to their lips in the dark. He had, and that changed everything. As an older man, Nate took up ranching. Not a big operation, just enough to keep him busy and grounded. He hired people others ignored, an ex-slave with a crooked leg, a runaway boy from the city, a half-Comanche woman who never spoke. His neighbors whispered. Nate didn't care. He carved out a quiet kind of life, and in that quiet, he often remembered the Kiowa camp, not with fear, but with a strange, aching clarity. He remembered Tauhausen's face, the weight of his judgment. He remembered the sting of rawhide and the fire in Hanya Haka's eyes, and most of all, he remembered Mesa. He wondered what had happened to her. Had she been punished, married off? Had she fled the tribe altogether? He would never know. But her act had set a course in him, one that would never be undone. One autumn evening, long after the cattle had been bedded down, Nate sat on the porch of his ranch and listened to the wind rustling through the tall grass, the same sound he'd heard on the day they captured him, the same wind that had swept across the cottonwoods where she first told him to run. He closed his eyes and whispered her name. Mesa. He didn't say it often, never aloud. But here, in the company of nothing but the stars, it felt right. The world was full of stories. Some were loud and bloody, carved into monuments and textbooks. Others were quiet, passed down in glances and gestures. And then there were the stories no one told, the ones carried only by the wind. Mesa's story was one of those. And he would carry it to his grave. The lesson Nate carried from that time wasn't written in any Bible or ledger. It was simple. It was human. In the heart of cruelty, there can still be compassion. In the middle of a war between worlds, two people can meet not as enemies, not as symbols, but as souls. He had once believed the world was divided: white and native, right and wrong, good and bad. But Mesa had shattered that illusion. She had shown him a different kind of courage, the kind that defies not just danger, but expectation. And because of that, he had lived, not just survived. Lived. They say the frontier was won with rifles and rails, but sometimes it was won with mercy, with one act of quiet rebellion in the dark. Mesa never asked to be remembered, but Nate remembered her anyway. And now, so do we.